Well, boys, we did it. We hit 500 subscribers. I recorded an entire intro where I thanked everybody for putting me right at the top and making sure to say that I would never forget who really put me there. Okay, now that we've gotten through that 30-second delay, I know that my microphone is working. I recorded that entire thing without my microphone working. Well, as I was saying before, my microphone decided to finally start working again. We did it. We achieved 500 subscribers. It is an incredible goal. I got word from YouTube that they're finally sending me my 500 subscriber play button. I'm not going to forget who put me here. It's all you guys. You're the real ones. You're the real MVP. You put me in this position. However, since I didn't actually properly read the requirements on YouTube's backend, I didn't realize that achieving 500 subscribers was only one part of the requirement that I needed to get this channel monetized. For super chats, I also need 3,000 public watch hours, which I'm currently sitting in. I think it's about 130 hours because you guys not enough of you are watching this whole thing to the end. I mean, that's where the really good stuff is once you get an hour into the podcast, that's where the really good stuff is. So just keep watching, keep that watch time coming, and maybe we'll achieve 3,000 watch hours sometime by the end of this century. That would be fun. It's been really fun to watch the numbers go up in real time. Even though it's such a small channel, my wife and family and stuff have been noticing that I've been getting so giddy watching the numbers go up, and whenever a few hours pass and I get another subscriber, I'm all giddy and excited and happy, and that's because it's been a while since I've felt those kinds of feelings towards the numbers. It's been a long time, and those numbers sort of become meaningless over time. But now that I've started a brand new little baby channel, it's been a lot of fun to watch those numbers go up. It's been really exciting, And again, like I said, I won't forget you guys. You guys are in here on the ground floor. I won't forget who put me there. Today we are trying and failing to keep to a schedule. So I was going to stream the other day, and of course I ran out of time by setting up, so I had to and then yesterday I just forgot yesterday, not going to lie. That's how it is. I appreciate honesty in the streamers that I watch, and that's why I'm being honest and forward with you, of course. Hello and welcome to the Suibhne podcast, the Rabbit Hole podcast, episode number 5. That was an unplanned introduction. This is a show. This is a very loosey-goosey show where we don't stick to a schedule, and where I just sort of run down a little bit of a rabbit hole. Whatever's bothering me this week, whatever's on my mind, and whatever rabbit hole it has been that I got myself lost in, I'm just going to talk about it. I'm going to talk about it in as much or as little detail as is possible. I am unqualified to teach you, so I don't even know what you're really doing here. But if you do want to support the channel, you can do so by going and joining the Patreon, which is up on which should be linked in the description. It's the Patreon of the main channel, and there's already a bonus episode of the podcast up there. Ooh, excuse me, where you can listen to that, or you can become a channel member on the main channel, of course. And that is currently also the way that you can guarantee a question being answered. So if you've watched any of the previous episodes and you want a question answered, that's a way you can do that. So I just woke up, and that's why my voice is feeling so croaky. We finally did it. We hit the 500 goal subscriber mark. And last week I was thinking that we might hit it live on air, but we did not. We were talking a little bit about, well, basically the topic of the video that I'm working on is Serbia. And basically all my most recent episodes have been little rabbit holes that have to do with that. This last week we were talking about Balkan militarism, specifically focusing on Serbia and where that comes from. These are traditions that go back a long time, and they're all very interesting. I've been reading Tim Judah's book called The Serbs. It's a fantastic book, detailing the history of the Serbian people. So it's called History, Myth, and the Destruction of Yugoslavia. And Tim Judah he's a fantastic author, and he writes in a way that I find very easy to get through. He writes sort of the way that I write, I feel like, in my head, and that's what makes him. And I just inherently like people who are like me. So, and I have a bias towards those people. And frankly, I think all people should write their books like me. Anyway, so I was reading this passage, a couple of these passages about the practice of village burning. That is, burning villages in the Balkans. It is a practice that you hear about most recently during some of those insurrections in places like Kosovo and during the Yugoslav wars. You would often hear about these villages that were being burned and the smoke plumes that would rise over the horizon. The burning of villages and the exodus of the defeated population is a normal and traditional incident of all Balkan wars and insurrections. It is the habit of all these people. What they have suffered themselves, they afflict upon others. In another section, in the war that began in 1991, the Serbian leadership must take the lion's share of the blame, but they could not have organized militias who knew from the experiences of generations exactly what to do unless their own forefathers had been practiced in the art of village burning as they were in fleeing from their own flaming hamlets. Militias cum bandit gangs, official or not, have always been a feature of war in the Balkans, and the last war is no different from any that went before it. Village burning and ethnic cleansing have, as the Carnegie Endowment pointed out, traditionally accompanied Balkan wars. And then there's another section here that goes on to talk about a famous poem called The Mountain Wreath that was written by the Prince Metropolitan Danilo Njegoš. He was the Prince Bishop or Prince Metropolitan of Montenegro. We talked a little bit about Montenegro in a couple of the previous episodes. So it's a historically Serb kingdom, one of these fragmented pieces of the old Serbian Empire that managed to do a little bit of guerrilla-type warfare against the Ottoman Empire during its conquest and gain the protection of places like Venice. And they sort of set up this like little nucleus up in the mountains where the local religious leaders sort of became these elected monarchs, in essence becoming prince bishops or prince metropolitans. And they kept that tradition for quite a long time. They managed to maintain a lot of their independence through the protection of Venice, as well as the protection of places like Russia, who sort of got really interested in the Balkans during the early modern period. And during the rise of Serbian nationalism, one of their princes wrote this poem called The Mountain Wreath, which talks about the rebirth of the Serbian nation and how they must destroy everything that is a threat to that nation. And we'll talk a bit about that in an upcoming video. But a little piece here talking about it. In Njegoš's 1847 epic, The Mountain Wreath, Metropolitan Danilo agonizes over the question of what to do about Montenegrins who had converted to Islam. There was a duty to protect one's brother and one's clan, but there was also a duty to one's faith and nation. Ideally, the renegades could be persuaded to return to the true faith, but if they would not, they would have to be extirpated, done away with. It is hard to underestimate the influence of the Mountain Wreath. Today, it is still celebrated as one of the pinnacles of Serbian literary achievement. But in the wake of another Balkan war, its significance is that of a missing link, It helps examine how the Serbian national consciousness has been molded and how ideas of national liberation became inextricably intertwined with the act of killing your neighbor and burning his village. I want to talk about that today. This is a hard topic because it's going to get uncomfortably close to things that we'd rather not think about. Burning a village, that's not very nice. We don't like to think about that. That is something that is practiced in warfare a lot, but it has a very specific aim, doesn't it? Because you can't return if you're sort of a flood of refugees. It's hard to return to your homes if your village has been burned down, and that's kind of the point. But before we get into that, here we have a beautiful artwork. If you are listening to the audio-only version of this, what can I tell you? It's a beautiful piece of artwork. It is depicting I believe this is a Turkish miniature. I don't know if it was made in Turkey itself, but it was made during the period of the Ottoman Empire. I am not an art historian, and I have not prepared well enough for this episode. But it was made at some point during the Ottoman Empire in a very the art style is these little miniatures that were. This was a very popular thing in Turkey and the Islamic world as a whole, depicting the battle of, or I should say, the siege of Belgrade, and this was happening during the initial conquests of the Balkans. So I don't know if I can get it to move. Oh, yes, I can. See, I'm not a very accomplished streamer, despite what you may think. So this is a really, really gorgeous replication of a Turkish miniature depicting the battle or the siege of Belgrade, and this was drawn by Teabag, which you can see their at handle, at handles there on screen. Just below, if you see artists on screen, you can go follow them, and they are available for commissions, I am sure. So if you like their work, please don't hesitate to contact them. A really gorgeous replication. So Alexandra B. Oh, village burning. The Turks port might have even thought that to the Impaler, taught that to the Impaler himself. Yeah, it is possible. One of the things that makes, I assume you're talking about Vlad the Impaler. So this is a practice that often gets lumped into the Turks. And it is sort of blamed on them for introducing this practice to the Balkans. And in a lot of ways that might be true. They certainly, the Ottoman Empire's size and the population that it controlled ended up being so large during its height was what do they call the long 19th century or something. I can't remember exactly what that period of time is called. It's this really, really extended period. It's not really a century, it's longer than a century. It's a period of time in which technology and irrigation and improvements in things like the climate mean that there's a sudden population boom, and this is sort of the time that the Ottoman Empire has its real zenith. It is really climbing and becoming really powerful, and the amount of resources and manpower that it controls is so large that the practice, it's not just sort of one or two armies that you're sending through at any given time. You're controlling much more manpower and resources to be able to wage a much larger scale warfare. And that is possibly why it is remembered that village burning can be attributed to them, even if the practice is much older. But we're getting ahead of ourselves because we need to talk about, let's sort of set ourselves some context. So the Mountain Wreath was written, I think it was written sort of in the middle of the 19th century, during the age of Serbian nationalism, and the Serbs themselves in the middle of in sort of that southern part of the Danube, in an area called Smederevo. It had won a little bit of independence, which I'll show on the map in a second, and it had sort of managed to attain a little bit of its dream of restoring its nation state. And I think that was all on the brain And this is at a time when the Ottoman Empire just sort of started to seem like it was slipping. It was slipping down. But let's set ourselves up in some context of where we should actually be. So here is a little screenshot from the upcoming video. These are this is during the conquest of the Magyars. This is also sort of my own take. This is sort of supposed to be reminiscent of a drawing or a painting. I think I looked into the painting itself. Again, I'm not an art historian, but the painting, it's the drawing that depicts this scene is supposedly like a replication of an older actual painting. I'm not sure. I could be mistaking a couple of different things in my mind, and it's the death of Czaslav. So Czaslav was one of these early medieval polities that existed prior to the establishment of the independent Serbian kingdom, which sort of gets caught in this world, in these interstate hemispherical disputes. Inter-hemispherical disputes. I'm going to coin that term. I think that's the perfect way to describe this like battle that is happening between the East and the West. And when the Serbian kingdom had set itself up, it established itself as this like weird buffer zone border area in relation to the East and the West. And in the West, you have the Catholics, and in the East, you have what eventually became the Eastern Orthodox Church. Prior to the establishment of that kingdom, you had little independent Serbian polities that are essentially shrouded in mystery. We don't really know all that much about them. And one of the theories as to why that is because of the arrival of the Magyars. The Magyars is an antiquated term for the Hungarians. The Hungarians have gone by many names. It's not one of those things. In today's language of Hungarian, the country of Hungary is known as Magyarország or something. I can't pronounce it, but it means like land of the Magyars. You know, the Magyar is the umbrella term for all of these tribes that sort of got together. But this isn't a story about Hungary. The Hungarian arrival in Europe was incredibly devastating, and it was devastating in a sense that it had a very long-lasting impact. The current state, the nation state of Hungary, can trace its roots to the political entity that was set up by the Magyars, this Christian kingdom in the year, I think it's like 1000. So this is like right in the middle of the Middle Ages, the Middle Ages of the Middle Ages. The inter-Middle Age Middle Ages, the inter-aged age of the middle of the ages, right in the middle. Anyway, one of the earliest political leaders were who they called Župans, or another term for them, I think, is Kier, which means something like lord or military leader or commander. So one of these early leaders is Czaslav. He's like an early prince or Župan of what we would today consider to be sort of northern and western Serbia. Northern and western Serbia, parts of Bosnia, Montenegro, those sorts of areas. It's very difficult to determine exactly where these people lived and what area they controlled, because maps that go back far enough are essentially just a lie. They are a lie because they didn't have delineated borders the same way that we have them today. And I feel like that's a much richer world we live in because we have gorgeous, beautiful maps. For map nerds like me, just imagine if the world didn't have maps. You know, what would map nerds like me do for fun? We would just be really sad. And I think the invention of maps and delineated borders is purely to satiate people like me who really enjoy. Okay, anyway, so this is the conquest of the Hungarians, and this is depicting, you know, sort of the death of one of the last, essentially, legendary or semi-legendary, in fact, leaders. And they killed him, and they threw him into the water, or he was drowned in the water, something like that. And who you're seeing in the background is the Magyars. Initially, these would have been they would have come from the steppes, We love the steppes, the open flat grasslands of Eurasia. And there's a tiny little piece of the steppe located in the Balkans in Eastern Europe called the Pannonian Plain, the Pannonian Basin. The Hungarian Plateau is one of the names that it gets. So this is that sort of central part of Eastern Europe, which is like the perfect base of operations for these Magyars to come from. And sort of what it's showing here, this is around the time that we're sort of talking about. That's sort of like late early Middle Ages, before the Middle Ages, very much before the late Middle Ages, the late part of the early part of the Middle Ages, which is all very easy to understand and not confusing at all. And basically, I wish I could give you a year. I don't know the years off the top of my head, but eventually you have these people are coming in. And the orange part that you can see on screen, that's the Pannonian Basin, and it is bounded to the east by a large string of mountains called the Carpathian mountain ranges. The Carpathian Basin is another name for this area of flat steppe land. So sort of, if you see sort of Crimea over to the east there, and then that northern region there, that's all part of the steppe. That's sort of like grayish green and like light lime gray green, that sort of area up there to the far right underneath the view counter, where we have all 5 of you who are listening. Hello, 5 of you. Give this video a like, by the way, to help it get out to people. That is the steppes, and that sort of buffers up against what eventually is this border region of the Carpathian Basin. This is the Carpathian mountain ranges, and that sort of forms a nice defensible border. So any steppe-like culture that managed to travel really, really far and punch deep into enemy territory on horseback. Horses travel a lot faster than men, I assume. I've never seen a horse in real life. I've heard that they're awesome. I think that they travel faster because they have 4 legs, and 4 legs is more than what we have. We have 2 legs, so they have double the speed that we have. And the problem when you get up to those speeds really is the bugs that fly into your eyes. But luckily, horses have really long eyelashes, so they can keep those bugs out of their eyes. We don't have that, so we have to put on things like masks. We have to put on helmets to prevent the bugs from flying into our eyes. Otherwise, you're swallowing bugs, and it's a good source of protein, but it's not a sustainable diet, and that is why these people died out. So they came in and they settled the Carpathian Basin, and they basically used the Carpathian Basin as this like base of operations to ravage and plunder everything around them. They were a plundering civilization in the same way that the Vikings were. And it's no surprise that they were actually very active during the time of the Vikings. When medieval European records from this era basically talk about like 3 things that were the scourge. This was a scourge from God who was he was punishing Christendom because we weren't good Christians. They talk about 3 things: the Hungarians, the Vikings, and the infidels. They had lots of different words for all of these people. The infidels, what's another name for them? Moors, Saracens, whatever you want to call them. These like Islamic empirical powers that were dominating the North Mediterranean, or should I say the South Mediterranean here, Africa down here. So I haven't actually drawn them there, so it's not helpful at all. These Saracens and these raiders are sort of like leapfrogging from like Spain and Italy and sort of the Balearic Islands, and they're sort of ravaging these Christian political entities. And from the north up here, you have the Danes and the Swedes and the Norwegians, these Vikings who are coming over and plundering. These were plundering these were plundering times. They sort of jumped into this like big pool of big rich kingdoms that had flourished in wealth and prosperity and power, and set up these beautiful, gorgeous kingdoms that had lots of wealth and crowns, and they're just digging up gold out of the ground. They're finally achieving a little prosperity since the collapse of the Roman Empire, and they're achieving things like making crowns and monasteries and things. These things were poorly defended. You had these castles and stuff, but monasteries, they're very poorly defended, and they have a lot of money. So in come the Vikings and Hungarians and the Saracens, and they start like plundering these like old Roman villages and hamlets and all these sorts of things, and they become plundering civilizations in and of themselves. That is their economic way of determining their existence. That is how they create value. They don't create value; they extract value like a business owner. They don't make the value themselves. They come along and they steal it, and that is essentially what they were. The Hungarians were medieval capitalists. That's what they were. They came along and took the surplus value from the hardworking Serbs and the hardworking peoples of the former Roman Empire. They came along and they extracted that surplus value by coming in like a landlord and taking not just like half of your wealth, but like all of your wealth, and then killing whoever happened to be in that monastery, and taking that and sort of being, that's, if you had to measure their GDP, their GDP like in modern day terms, like if you would look back at this early Hungarian political entity, it would have said, Hungarian kingdom has a GDP of X and its economy is based in plunder and destroying monasteries and taking all of the gold and the crowns. And that is essentially what comes on the rise. Whenever you have prosperity, you get these little like leeches on society that come along, and they start like picking at the little weak points of that society. So it's like, oh, you have a lot of money, you have a lot of wealth, you're turning gold into crowns, and you're turning gold into money, and you're creating a interconnected tradal system. Boom, we're going to come in and we're going to steal that stuff. We're finding the little weak points in that system. And I think it is all very funny and all very interesting to have these medieval warlords that are acting like landlords. So these Hungarians, when they come in and they steal all the money, they don't just steal all the money; they steal all the records, or they burn down the monasteries. They burn down the castles and villages that they manage to take. They usually go for these like small, unprotected, difficult to reach targets that normally are hard to defend if you have like a roaming standing army. If you're the Romans or you're the Bulgarians or whomever, and you want to send out an army to protect a specific point or monastery or strategic whatever have you, it's a lot harder to get your troops into position and defend that area. Rather, you have the Hungarians on their fast horses eating bugs on the way down, coming and destroying what is the record-keeping tradition of these political entities. So that is why it is shrouded in mystery, and I'm just realizing that entire rabbit hole was just explaining why there are no records and why there are very few. Well, there are very few records, and a lot of the records we have are scant. They don't tell us much, or they're just written far too long after the fact. And if one of the things that is difficult is these compilations of chronicles, and these chronicles are sort of referencing earlier sources that they have, in a sense that they when you have 13 different scrolls, each of which is, under various, is either old and been saved from a village being burnt or a monastery being burned, and you want to collate them all together, you'll just instead of carrying around 13 scrolls, maybe you just do one scroll, and you turn all of those 13 scrolls and you just transcribe them. But of course, whenever you transcribe something, you're losing detail. It's just one of those consequences of the traditions, the literary traditions that existed before the printing press. And you're losing a lot of detail, and it gets really fuzzy and difficult and then embellished, and it's just really, really hard, is what I'm saying. So here, what you can see is you used to have the Roman Empire, which is in purple. The Western Roman Empire has already collapsed, and you have these large political entities that have basically subsumed this territory in the Balkans. In green, you have the Bulgarians, the Bulgarian Empire. They themselves also came from the steppe a lot earlier than the Hungarians, but they'd set up and integrated into the Roman system. And they'd become really powerful themselves in the Balkan mountain ranges, and that sort of that area over there that you can see. They'd sort of managed to set up like their own independent empire and take over a lot of what was the Roman Empire. And then you have up in the central parts, you have the German kingdom or the German principalities. They'd also subsumed a lot of the Western Roman Empire, and then you have the Hungarians. And right in the middle there, you have the Serbs, and they're really. I say the Serbs. What I mean is more like these early Slavic political entities. You have these sort of coastal ones down here, sort of towards Dalmatia and Montenegro and Albania, and then you have the sort of inner ones, like Rash, which we talked about last week, and place names. Actually, if you want to learn a little bit more about the place names that are have to do with this area, so you have like Illyria or Rash, or Serbia or Vojvodina or Kosovo or Bosnia. Check out the Patreon, because there's an entire bonus episode up there talking about these things. And you can, no matter what tier you choose, you can get a bonus episode. And I'm going to do more bonus episodes just for the patrons or YouTube members. And if you want to join and become a YouTube member, you can go to the main channel and do that. And any question you want to have answered live on the podcast, you can comment there, and I'll do it right at the end. And yeah, so the Serbs are sort of split between this area. So there's a light green area there. That's the Moravia. So that's sort of centered on the Morava River, and that area becomes sort of a vassal kingdom or a vassal principality to the Bulgarians before these Hungarians arrive. And the Hungarians basically subsume that role that Rome and the Bulgarians had once had. So they're becoming sort of entrenched. They're caught in this like inter-hemispherical world, is what I'm saying. That's the sort of time period that we're talking about. Much, much later to this, when the Hungarians are sort of gaining a little bit more momentum as a state. They become a Christian state in the late Middle Ages, after the Middle Ages. That's how you know that it's after the Middle Ages, because it's after the middle, and after the middle is the late, and before the middle is the early. So they set up their own empire. That empire is rapidly rising. This is that blue part that you're seeing on the map. That empire is rapidly gaining momentum as the collapse of the Eastern Roman Empire is happening. And around the same time, you've got the House of Osman, which is the sort of red burgundy bit on the east. And they're sort of arising around the same time. And when you have two empires arising and taking as much Roman territory as they can, eventually they're going to come to blows. And what is happening, like I think we talked about in a previous episode, is that the Bulgarians and the Romans, to an extent, are hiring the Turks. The House of Osman controls a whole bunch of these like Turkish highly populated areas, and they're hiring them as mercenaries. They're saying, come and fight for me, because their state institutions have shrunk so much they don't control as much manpower as they used to. And the House of Osman is getting super duper rich by selling mercenaries to these kingdoms to help fight their wars. And the problem is, when you hire mercenaries, you're literally giving them wealth. You're extracting wealth from your own population in order to pay these mercenaries. That is an economic exchange that is basically only downsides, because you're not only giving them a lot of wealth and allowing them to grow in economic power, you're also enabling those Turks, those mercenaries, to like become familiar with the Balkans and find its weak points and sort of see what's going on, who's fighting who, getting involved in politics between these dynastic families. And that is as powerful and as important as the gold and the soldiers itself. Information is what makes these empires. And becoming this mercenary force, the Turks sort of say to themselves, hey, why don't we just take little bits and pieces of the Balkans? Because the Roman parts of that empire, sort of these very urbanized parts of society, these are parts of society that are very alien to the nomadic cultures that arrived. The Seljuk Turks had arrived in the early Middle Ages, which was before the middle of the Middle Ages, just in case you got confused there. And they'd arrived in Anatolia and sort of set up a very like outside of the city's civilization. They're semi-nomadic and they're having this interaction with the Roman cities and eventually subsuming or controlling those cities a lot more. So this urban population, they come in and they say, why don't we take all of this? We've got rapid warfare. We're very good at defeating armies. They learn how to fight against these foot soldiers. They learn how to fight these Byzantine, old, antiquated style warfare that hadn't changed all that much in a long time. You know, there's a cavalry tradition in the Balkans that traces its roots to the Byzantine Empire as well. It's sort of like these kind of like Greek knights, sort of these heavily armored cavalry, but they're very expensive. They're very expensive to maintain and have just as a society, and they're easily defeated by rapid horse-based archer warfare. And this is a tale as old as time. The Romans were fighting against the Parthians. The Parthians were, and they didn't respect the Parthians back in antiquity. They didn't respect the Parthians because the Parthians would just come along on their horses and ride around in a big horse circle shooting arrows at the Romans. And the Romans were like, come here and fight me, you coward. And the horse Parthians were like, tell that to my arrow, you dumb Roman. And the Romans, they never really got a hold of the Parthians. They never really managed to control or exert a lot of influence over these horse-based warriors. Can't remember where I was going with this. Oh yeah, the Turks. So the Turks come in and they're really taking over. And they're doing it different to the people who had done it before. They're doing it differently to the way the Hungarians had done it and the Bulgars had done it. They're really integrating themselves into the system like never before. They are embracing the urbanization of the former Roman Empire. They're embracing the economic power that these cities have, these old ancient Roman cities. Well fortified, and they use that to their advantage, but they never really let go of that nomadic part of themselves as well. So not only do they embrace that like really strong urban fortified type of existence that the Romans had their strength in, but they also have this highly mobile, highly light cavalry armies and that kind of thing happening as well. And they embrace gunpowder later on, which they're one of the first to embrace gunpowder along these like long trade routes with China. That gives them a significant advantage in these old fortified parts of the Balkans, because cannons are something that gets quite popular because they can break through castle walls. They can break right through those bad boys. Castle walls ain't got nothing on a cannon. The Turks famously broke through the walls of Constantinople, the capital of the Roman Empire. That was like a big factor in why they were able to achieve such great success. So this is a very much like Turkey itself and the Balkans in general is the sort of meeting point between the West and the East. It is this Asian tradition meets this European tradition. Like the Balkans and Turkey itself, the Ottomans embrace both sides of these military traditions, and they get really powerful and they conquer. They don't just come and plunder. They're not just out to steal, but of course they do a lot of stealing. They do a little stealing over here. They're a little bit kleptocratic, but mostly, they're inventing their own new form. So the Ottoman Empire gets really big, and it starts to look something like this. So all of these sort of like light red colored bits, these are all the bits that sort of set themselves up as being subordinate to the Ottoman Empire. And the reason why I colored them is because in this way, I don't know if they'd been like formally incorporated into the Ottoman administrative system yet. They may have been at this point. The Ottoman administrative system by this point would have been called like sanjaks. That's like their territorial, like a province almost, and they would have had sort of like a military governor and like their own aristocratic elite. You had also land grants that happened very similar to what was happening in feudal Europe, but just in a slightly different origin. And these like sipahi, I think they were called, where they granted them land and as a sort of fief, and you could sort of extract the military. The military needs to protect that area could be extracted from the local population's surplus economic value. And these initially would have been little military governing outposts using the local population, those local leaders. The really, really small parts of their administrative power were generally just handed out to the local Slavic or Albanian or Greek population themselves. The smallest pieces. So it's a way of inspiring loyalty. So in comes a Islamic army. They conquer the territory, and they say to them, "Okay, well, your little village, you can rule. You can have your own leader. You can be a local person who is loyal to us, and you can collect all the taxes for us. However, the real head honchos, they need to be Muslim. They either need to be converts, which happens on some scale. They're converts to Islam, so local Slavic people, or Albanian people, or Greek people or Vlachs who convert to Islam and decide that they want to rise through the ranks in that way. And then most of the time, the Ottomans just move in their own people, their own already loyal people that come in and they rule these areas as these little semi-independent fiefdoms, and they're controlling the wealth, they're controlling the tax, and all these Christians get put under a special tax that they need to pay. They get recognized. They have certain legal privileges to continue practicing their faith. But a lot of their institutions and their religion and their church and that kind of thing, this gets plundered, and a lot of that economic value goes towards the Ottoman state. Especially like if a place had resisted, that territory would then become like the Ottomans' personal property. And one of the ways that the church was put into slavery in Serbian historiography, they call it the church in slavery. And the reason that happens is because the lands, these estates, these former like feudal estates with these peasants on them that kept the monastic tradition going and that sort of thing, these had been formerly owned by the church. In comes the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, and he says, "That's my property now. I'm not handing that out to anyone. That's my personal property, and any economic value that's going to happen is going to go disproportionately right into my coffers." And then, at a certain point, the Ottomans offered them a deal to exchange that for a form of debt, a debt bondage, so they could pay off their land and essentially be in this sort of indentured servitude where it was almost impossible to pay your way out of that debt. It had lasted many centuries. They used village burning on a very large scale during these conquests. The Turks would come in and they understand that disrupting the the ability for these Christian kingdoms to mount a response. When you gather an army together, you've got to go out, you've got to train the soldiers, you've got to have a working mine to dig up metal, and you've got to smelt that into weapons and armor, and you've got to arm all these peasants, and you've got to march them off into war. It's all very expensive. And for a long time, they'd been using Ottoman Ottoman mercenaries to do their fighting for them. So it's like, no matter what you do, you're losing, right? Like, you can resist for a little while, but eventually you're going to be losing. And to speed up that process, what the Ottomans did was they would practice burning of these small undefended villages. And these people would migrate. It would cause chaos, and they would migrate to try and get as far away as they could from the Ottomans. They're causing a refugee flood, a flood of people clogging up the roads. It's difficult to move armies down those roads when there's refugees trying to get away. It's difficult to raise an army if every village you send somebody to go and recruit people. You're like, you rock up, village burnt down. Okay, people aren't coming back in a hurry. And then they would burn the fields so that there wasn't enough food. And if there wasn't enough food, you couldn't sell it in the markets. And this disrupted the markets. A lot of the markets were in large fortified towns. Who's heading to the fortified towns? All of those refugees, because they want to come behind those big walls. They want to protect themselves. Now the markets are being disrupted by all these refugees. Now the markets aren't functioning. Now there's less taxes to collect. It's all this big domino effect that is resulting in the Christian kingdoms becoming weaker and the Ottoman Empire becoming a stronger over time. And a lot of it comes down to these burning down of villages. And what the Ottomans would do is they would settle, they would oftentimes expel whenever they would take a city. Over time, they would sort of appease them in this way or the other way. They could protect their whatever privileges they had. But over time, they sort of started implanting their own little colonies inside these big fortified areas. Belgrade, Smederevo, Niš, Skopje, Pristina, all these big, large fortified settlements. They started implanting Turks into those places. They became the majority of the population in a lot of those places. Whereas before you would have had like a Vlach or a Greek or a Slavic or an Albanian or Hungarian elite that lived in these cities and would have controlled everything beforehand. Now you have it very much falling into the Ottoman legal framework and becoming very Ottomanized cities. And this is something that causes a huge refugee flood into what is Hungary, this orange bit up here at the top. And we talked about a bit last week. We talked about we talked about in episode 1 the Great Serb Migrations, and we talked about Balkan militarism and these like fortified border areas. And this tradition continues. This is something that had existed for a long time. It was used by the Magyars, and before that it was used by the Avars and the Turks and the Bulgarians. They would burn these villages down so that you could not return and cause this major economic disruption. And because this is like one of these conquests where now these nomadic empires that had come before, these Hungarians and Bulgars, they'd eventually converted. They'd converted, the Hungarians converted to Catholic Christianity, and the Bulgars converted to Orthodox Christianity. They were in essence becoming subsumed by the cultures that they were invading. But the Turks, they'd arrived in such large numbers and they were so prosperous that they subsumed the cultures that they controlled to a large extent. And they were engaging in like actual colonization in not in the Western tradition. In the Western tradition of colonization is like you essentially you build up a city in that area. These ancient Greek versions of colonization. You set up a colonia, which is like you just make a little Greek island in the middle of this like other area far away. So they're not engaging in that kind of colonialism. They're sort of more engaging in like economic and religious colonialism, because that's what they see as their like mandate. Their mandate is to be an Islamic caliphate, and their leaders they make a claim to their authority being Islamic caliphs. So for them, spreading Islam is like one of their primary virtues. So this conflict that arises between these Christian kingdoms and the Turks starts to feel very crusadery. It starts to be written about very crusadery. The poetry about it feels like a crusading poem. The records about it feel like crusading records. Every war that is against these Turks is like framed as a war between Christians and infidels. It is a war between the believers and the unbelievers. And this has enormous effects, because now it's not nomadic barbarian Turks who are burning down your villages. Now it's Muslims are burning down your villages. Infidels burning down your villages. It takes on a really, really that takes on a much more different existential, apocalyptic kind of tone, doesn't it? It's no longer just like, oh, we're Christians and we're fighting against the other brand of Christians. Now suddenly it's, no, we're the promised people and we're fighting the Philistines. There is poetry that comes out of the Christian tradition describing the Turks as Philistines, describing the exodus of Slavs and Christians out of the Balkans and into Hungary and the Holy Roman Empire, in the same way that the biblical exodus is written. And it's talking about like a prophesied return, just sort of similar to like this like prophesied return to the Holy Land that Moses is said to fulfill as the descendant of Abraham, crossing a large body of water, the Red Sea, the Danube becomes this, like, it is so like intertwined in this like religious symbolism, and it is really strong. Like, so no longer are you like looking back at your burned down village as, oh, the enemy came in and what they really wanted was our plunder, and they came along and they took a bunch of our crowns and our gold and all that stuff. No longer is it that. Now it's apocalyptic. It's prophesaic. It is us versus this competing religious entity. This is another replication. This is also by Teabag of of the Serbian Revolution, which happens it is a long drawn out process. It sort of starts during the Napoleonic Wars, and it really gains momentum from there. This is the historic memory that Prince Bishop Njegoš would have remembered. His fathers and grandfathers would have fought in this war, trying to gain independence from the Ottomans. This romantic rebellion is inheriting a lot of that religious symbolism. This is the way that these paintings are painted, like rising up and self-sacrifice and heroism and martyrdom. It is all very romantic in the literary and artistic sense of the word, not romantic in the colloquial sort of relationship version of the word. I'm sure that there were marriages between Slavs and Turks, but I don't think the romance was there in quite the same way. It's romance in the least fun way. The romance in the sense of being like Romanesque and Renaissance-y, that's sort of romantic. This way of portraying the past or portraying what your historical lens is, that kind of romanticism, the romanticism movement that aims to depict things in the most like heroic, self-sacrificey way. This Romanesque, romantic tradition, not the sort of love-making PG-13 version of romantic. But I feel like they should have done it that way. That would have been a lot more fun. So this is the state that sort of arises during these rebellions, led by one of these like really brutal haiduks He's a Haiduk, he's a rebellion, a Chetnik, a guerrilla, a renegade, a cowboy named Kara George, which means like Black George. Kara George, and he's like an early rebel leader, and he sort of sets up this first semi-independent state, and then that doesn't get recognized. In the end, they eventually have to capitulate to the Ottomans, but eventually the bones of this state sort of set up a new rebellion, and that rebellion is far more successful. And it is timed to coincide with the peace negotiation that is happening during the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon gets defeated by the Russians, and there's this big sort of trajectory downward of Napoleon. Napoleon is going downwards, and eventually the state sort of succeeds to form an independent principality. Point being, what do you do with all the Turks? What do you do with all the Slavs that have converted to Islam? You know, they made no distinction in these times. Remember, this is a romantic idea of religious nationalism that sort of is birthed. They make no distinction between a Turk and an Albanian Muslim. They make no distinction between a Turk and a Slavic Muslim, somebody who had converted or whose family had converted to Islam, people who are ostensibly your brothers and speak your language. The Serbo-Croatian dialects that had propagated throughout this part of the Balkans and spread. They'd had a lot of neighbors who were converts to Islam, or whose family were converts to Islam, or who were just Turks who had settled in the area a long time ago, and whose family members were part of the Ottoman state, that kind of thing. There was no distinction made in these people's minds between those kinds of Muslims. They were all just Turks. And the word Turk, even to this day in the Balkans, is used as a slur. You will often find people who hate each other in the Balkans yelling that the other one is a Turk. You know, you're a Turk, you're not a real Serb, or you're not a real Croat, you're not a real blah, 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 blah. You're all Turks, and they call each other Turks as a slur. And this is because this traces its roots to this, like, village burning. You are part of the people that burned our villages, so we're going to burn your villages back. This is the cycle that happens with these village burnings. This is now a state that is filled to the brim with, yes, lots of poor Orthodox Christians, but a lot of slightly less poor Muslims. These are settlers. These are converts who have been like first-class citizens within the Ottoman system. They'd had a lot of privileges. They gained a lot of wealth. They gained a lot of prosperity over the centuries by being Muslims. Suddenly, there's a target on their back. In revolution, you've got to have an enemy to go after. So even if you win on the battlefield, you've got to have a new enemy. You've got to have a new place to direct your anger. You've got to have a new target, a new enemy to direct all of your anger against. And to them, it was like, well, we've defeated the Turks on the battlefield, but what about the Turks who live among us? Turks, again, that slur being used as a slur against their brothers, their compatriots, their people who lived side by side with them in many cases. Sometimes the next village over. On this side of the river, you have a Serb village. On that side of the river, a Turk, quote-unquote, village, which is possibly just like a Vlach, or, you know, like a romance in the linguistic sense of the word, so Vlachs like Romanians, or Armenian. There are actually a lot of Armenians that get supplanted into this area, like Turkified Armenians who are like Turkish speaking and converts to Islam themselves, who come and live in this area, or who are just like Christian Armenians, but different branch of Christians, so that they just get sort of lumped in with the Turks too. They form like a big part of the administrative system and the trading system, same with the Vlachs. Jews, that kind of thing. Jews came along and settled in large numbers during the Ottoman conquests. They very much fit into the Ottoman administration very, very well as this like middlemen between all these Christian communities and Islamic communities, especially with things like finance because of Islamic laws prohibiting interest gathering. So they had a lot of targets. They had a lot of great targets to look at and say, you're a Turk and you need to get out. And they went a burning of villages. This is, and it's horrific when you think about it. We think of these things. If these things happen today, and of course they have happened in our day, which we will get to, but if these things happen today, it would be a war crime. It would be an act of genocide, of ethnic cleansing. You know, there's a lot of mishmash and gray area and fuzzy areas in the meeting point between what is genocide, what is ethnic cleansing, what is a crime of war, what is a crime against humanity. And these are concepts that don't necessarily have a great legal basis at the time yet, a method of prosecution. And this was like just seen as part of what you do. You rise up and you get retribution. You burn down the villages of the Turk, quote unquote. This is horrific. They're sending, and remember, we're talking in much larger numbers too. The Ottoman Empire has grown incredibly wealthy and incredibly prosperous, and its population has exploded as time has gone on. So now you're not talking about like a few hundred refugees from a village or a few dozen refugees from a hamlet or whatever. Now you're talking in the thousands, in the tens of thousands of these Turks, quote unquote Turks, or whomever that cross and get out of this place, trying to seek safety in what remains of the Ottoman state. And the really sad part about it is that, like I said, when I say that these people were their brothers, the excerpt from the book that we read earlier, it says like the part of being what it meant to be a Serb, the Serbian national consciousness, the idea of becoming aware of yourself and your history has been molded, and how ideas of national liberation became inextricably intertwined with the act of killing your neighbor and burning his village. These were these people's neighbors. A lot of the time they spoke the same language. They were what if these Turks, quote unquote, existed today we would just call them Bosniaks, you know, or Albanians, or various other groups that converted to Islam. We would not make a significant distinction other than religion. And that is not the idea that they would have had at the time. They would have seen religion as the biggest and most consequential difference, which I think is incredibly sad and very reflective of the holdovers that are still plaguing this region of the world today. This is what happens and continues to happen as these Serbian states move further and gain further power and expand further into the lands that had once formed part of the Serbian kingdom that had been conquered. Now they are part of the Ottoman territory. All these sanjaks that had been overtaken that we talked about earlier. Now suddenly the Ottoman Empire is weakening and they're losing wars against the Europeans, and the Bulgarians rebel and the Romanians rebel and the Dalmatians and Bosnians are rebelling, and the Serbs, of course, are rebelling as well. So down there on the left, you got the like light blue on the western part. That is where Prince Njegoš is writing from. He is a Serbian leader of the Montenegrin clans. High up in the mountains, they've gotten really they've managed to maintain a lot of their independence over these times, and they are seizing the day as the Ottoman Empire is weakening. They're seizing the day and they're able to conquer a little bit more territory and expand their domains. Same with the Serbian Principality under the Obrenović dynasty. They're conquering more territory as well. They're conquering Niš, a large area, a large city on I think it's the Morava River. I can't remember exactly which river it is, but they're taking these former lands where their old principality, their old empire, their old kingdom had held a lot of power many centuries before the Battle of Kosovo, including, of course, Kosovo itself. And these areas are thoroughly depopulated of Serbs. A lot of the Serbs had fled from those parts of the world many generations earlier. But of course, the historic memory is kept alive, because burning down a village is only as effective as you can make those people forget where they came from. If you burn down a village and then you make these refugees flee, maybe they forget. Maybe they forget where they came from. They don't know where they came from after a couple of generations. The memory is not kept alive. But with poetry and with art and with the Romantic Revival and with the increase in literacy and with songs and with rebellion, those memories are kept alive. You don't easily forget a burned down village with all those things to keep the memory alive. And suddenly you're not just conquering territory. You're not a new political entity that is conquering territory. Now suddenly you're restorationists. Now suddenly you're just taking back what was once yours. That's the framing device that these Serbian principalities started using. We're not conquerors. We're not taking land away from somebody else. We're simply taking our land back, which is obviously a load of horseshit, but that's the way that these leaders had to justify it. Their legal right and claim to that authority was done to sort of say, well, we're just taking back what was once ours. Never mind the fact that a lot of the generations of people had been moved around and settled, and a lot of those people had been were forcibly moved to other places many centuries earlier. Like, it is so different to what it had been before. But the bones of that old Serbian Empire, of course, are still there. The monasteries still exist. A lot of the time, they're still held by keepers of that monastic tradition. You still have keepers of the Serbian monasteries and who are keeping the paint. They're still putting a lick of paint on the building every decade or so. So when these Serbian principalities conquer and move south, they see these monastic ruins and these large castles and big cities, and they read about them in their books, and they go, this is the bones of the once great Serbian Empire, which we are bringing back. We are rebirthing this. This is called palingenesis, I think it's called. It's the philosophy of rebirth, prophesied rebirth. All of these stories, these biblical stories, are coming back, and we're rebirthing our empire, and we're going to conquer the world, and we're going to bring in a new world order. This is the way they're talking about this stuff. It is all very intense, religious and nationalist and hot blood and militaristic, and all of these things are coming together in a big overlapping Venn diagram, several different overlapping Venn diagram circles, like this like coming to fruition of this like prophesied palingenesis, this prophesied rebirth. And that is the context in which you can get a soldier to pick up a torch and burn down a village. They don't care about anything else at that point. They've taken up arms, and they're going to war against the infidels, and they march down the roads and they say, what was done unto us, we now do unto you. It's all very like, it's all like crazy and hot-blooded and militarized and insane, really. It's kind of hard for us to really understand how militarized these early modern periods nation states were. The insane levels of military buildup all over the continent, all over the globe really, but all over the continent of Europe, this rise up and rebel obsession with militarized societies, kind of like how the Middle Ages was dominated by feudalism and this like economic necessity to like protect these little independent fiefdoms. That was the method that was used before centralized control, like after centralized control had collapsed during the Roman Empire. Now you have instead of feudalism, you have these insanely like militarized kingdoms that fight with one another in major catastrophic wars to assert economic dominance, and they're fighting over these border regions between them. You know, how many wars have the Prussians and the Austrians and the Poles fought over Silesia? How many wars have the Austrians and the Germans fought over the Kingdom of Bohemia? How many wars had the French and the Habsburgs fought over the Low Countries? These are all like little economic advantages that you can get over your opponent to ensure your own longevity at the expense of theirs. And that is essentially what happens during this early modern period, this intensely militarized society, marching armies, large billowing